Well, hello and welcome again to Life at Home Every Day, our daily devotions on the book of 1 Peter. And today we're going to be in 1 Peter chapter 4, and we're going to read verses 16 to 19. In fact, just for the context, I'm going to read from verse 15 onwards. But we're going to look today at yet another reason that Peter gives us for why we should be willing to suffer as Christians. And even in the passage that we've been looking at, even in chapter 4, a few verses before, we've seen one of the reasons that we should be happy to suffer as Christians, and that is that in verse 13 it tells us that we will rejoice and be glad when Jesus' glory is revealed. In other words, we're happy to suffer because we know that there's a greater time coming in the future. But Peter gives us another incentive for being happy to suffer as a Christian in the passage we're going to read today. So we're going to look at verses 16 to 19, but I'm going to start reading at verse 15 to give us the flow of the sentence. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, or a thief, or an evildoer, or as a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel? And if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. So Peter has explained in verse 15, and we would have seen that yesterday, some reasons that we shouldn't suffer. So as Christians, we should not really be those who suffer as murderers. So we should not be suffering because we're murdering people or being thieves or evildoers. That's not fitting for Christians. That is not a reason to suffer. But then Peter goes on to say, but if someone suffers as a Christian, and what he means by that is not just that they happen to be a Christian and they're suffering. He means that they're suffering because they are a Christian. He says, let him not be ashamed. If you're suffering, if you're going through opposition and difficulty and mocking and perhaps in many places even imprisonment and sometimes death, because you're a Christian, don't be ashamed. Okay? Now Peter probably means that both in the sense of us not feeling ashamed, but I think he also means that in the sense of don't shy away from being a Christian in those moments. What would it look like to be ashamed when you're suffering for being a Christian? Well, ultimately, the greatest form of being ashamed if you're suffering as a Christian would be to deny Jesus, to fall back away from him. And Peter's encouraging his readers, saying, if you're suffering because you're a Christian, don't deny Jesus. Don't be ashamed and therefore back away from everything that you believe. You shouldn't do that. Instead, what you should do is glorify God in that name. Now, the word Christian, although it's very common for us, originally for early Christians, it was often the people who came up with the phrase Christians seemed to be people who were mocking followers of Jesus. They called them Christians, which means little Christs. It's like, oh, look at those little Christs. They claim to follow the Christ. Let's call them little Christs. It wasn't really a badge of honor. It was meant to be a term of insult. It was like, oh, look at those little Christs. And Peter here is saying, if you're suffering because people are mocking you for being a follower of Jesus, don't back away, but instead you can bear that name of little Christ with honor. You can go through suffering and you can choose to keep going through suffering because you want to honor Jesus. And so what would it look like to glorify God if you're suffering as a Christian? Sometimes it looks like being willing to continue to suffer for Jesus. The easy option would be to say, actually, I'm not a follower of Jesus, let me off the hook from suffering. But Peter's saying, actually, the way you glorify God in a lot of moments as a Christian is to say, if I want to remain faithful to Jesus in this current situation, it's going to involve me continuing to suffer. And that's a price I'm willing to pay because I want to glorify God. I want to bear the name of a Christian in a way that honours God. And so Peter's saying that should be the way that we live. That should be the way that we are willing to approach suffering. But Peter then gives a reason why we should be happy to put up with suffering as Christians. And like I said, he's explained a number of reasons, one of the main ones being that we will get a reward at the end of time. But the reason that Peter gives in these particular verses is that the judgment of God has started to come upon humanity, and it has started with the church. So he says in verse 17, "For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And he quotes here a proverb, if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? Now, Peter's explaining one of the reasons that you don't want to deny Jesus or be ashamed of him as a Christian is because when you go through suffering in this life, it's actually a form of God bringing judgment upon his church. Now, we've got to be careful the way we hear that, because if we hear the word God bringing judgment on his church, we might immediately think, oh, the church has done something wrong. But that doesn't seem to be the way that Peter is using that language here. The way Peter seems to be thinking of God bringing judgment upon his church in this particular situation is that God is allowing his people to go through difficulties in order to refine them and to purify them, which is something we saw in chapter 1, that as we go through difficulties as Christians, our faith actually becomes stronger. And so when Peter says the time for judgment is beginning with the church, he doesn't mean that the church is in trouble. Oh my goodness, the church has done something wrong, God's going to strike them down. It means God is allowing his people to go through difficulties so that their faith would be stronger and stronger. But this same judgment one day will come upon those who have rejected the gospel. And at that point, it won't be a judgment that leads to them being refined and their faith being strengthened. It actually ends up being a judgment that leads to their eternal condemnation. And that's a terrifying thing, but it's actually a motivation that Peter gives us to be faithful. He says those who are faithful actually are experiencing the discipline of God, they're experiencing what it looks like for God to allow them to go through suffering so that they become more and more like Jesus. And they are avoiding the condemnation that the rest of the world will experience on the day of judgment. And maybe a way of thinking this through, because it might sound a little bit complex, is to think of the idea of gardening. Okay, now when you're gardening and you have a bush that you want to grow and you want it to do better and better, you prune it. Okay, you cut off certain branches, and that might look really painful sometimes. So if you're pruning a rose bush, you sometimes cut off so many of the branches that it looks like there's just a tiny stump left. It feels like judgment. It feels like you are bringing judgment upon that particular bush. But what you're doing is you are allowing it to go through difficulties in order that it would grow back even better. However, if you want to get rid of weeds, you might do the same kind of thing. You're going to cut the weeds down, you're going to uproot them. It might look on the surface of it like you're doing the same thing, but actually the end result is completely different. And I think that is what Peter is talking about here. He's saying, on the one hand, the suffering that we go through in this present life might feel like it's this moment where God's rooting us up, but actually that's not what's going on. What's happening is God is pruning us to allow us to become more and more like Jesus. But there's a day coming that for those who do not obey the gospel and do not follow Jesus, where it is going to be more like the weeds being uprooted, and they're going to be chucked into, like you would with gardening, you might chuck it into the incinerator. And we need to appreciate that. And so Peter is saying, let's live in a way where we're not ashamed of the gospel, because in the present, we will experience difficulty, but when we respond well to those difficulties, God is going to use that to help us to grow more and more like Jesus. But those who reject the gospel ultimately will end up being condemned when the final judgment comes. And let's look to put that into practice, even in this difficult season that we're living in. If you are experiencing difficulties, mocking perhaps by friends, mocking by family, even for some of you perhaps rejection by family because you follow Jesus, can I encourage you in the two ways that Peter encourages us to suffer in this chapter? Keep remaining faithful to Jesus. One, because you will have a reward on the day of judgment. And number two, as we've seen in this passage, because the judgment of God is starting with the church. But it's a judgment that is going to lead to you growing and becoming more and more like Jesus. It's not a judgment that's going to lead to you being condemned with the rest of the world. And we need to remember that as we go through difficulties and opposition for the sake of the gospel. So let me wrap up in prayer, and let's honour Jesus with our lives. Father, I pray that you would help us to be willing to suffer as Christians, that we would be willing to put up with abuse and mocking for the sake of Jesus, knowing that when you bring judgment on your church, it is so that, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11, we would not be condemned with the rest of the world, but that actually you discipline us as a good father disciplines his children. And I pray you'd help us to live our lives today However much we are feeling the difficulty of following you, I pray you'd help us to remain faithful and to not be ashamed of you today. In Jesus' name, amen.